Today is September 1st. My name is Bryana Ruiz, and I have the pleasure of interviewing Ricardo Negron Almodovar from the He is the Legal Services Coordinator of Latino Justice at PRODEF on behalf of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program and the UCI Latino Policy and Politics Initiative. And so, Ricardo, can we start by you just telling me a little bit about yourself? From where you were born to your job now.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, and I moved here to Florida back in 2015, in July of 2015. So it's been 5 years and a couple months. I'm a licensed attorney in Puerto Rico, and here when I moved to Florida, I've always kind of like been working with the immigrant, Latinx, and Puerto Rican community through the nonprofit sector. Initially, I was teaching English to adults, so English as a second language to mostly Mexican, Venezuelan, Colombian, and Puerto Rican communities living in Central Florida in Apopka, which is it's about 30 minutes north of Orlando, and it has a huge immigrant community, particularly farming community. So we were doing a project with the Florida Immigrant Coalition, the Farm Workers Association, and I was part of the AmeriCorps. And we did 11 months of ESL for adults. And that was particularly eye-opening for me, seeing how like all the struggles, like as a Puerto Rican, to just not to say that we don't have our own struggles, right? Because we do. The island is economically oppressed, pretty much so. But we do have this hurt. I guess it's a need of moving. Like if we decide that we want to move to somewhere in the States, it doesn't come with that baggage of getting a visa or being undocumented and all of that. So it was eye-opening to really see the struggles that a lot of people in the communities go through and how they don't have access to the same resources or how they're not even aware that resources exist. And doing that work, I connected with like other nonprofit organizations. I started doing voter registration because it was 2016 by then, so it was presidential election year like it is now. And there's always a big push here in Florida to move the Latinx vote, and particularly the Puerto Rican vote, since it's an ever-growing community. And as I mentioned before, as soon as we're here, we can pretty much register to vote the next day that we move here. So it's, one can understand why there's always this interest in mobilizing the community and this messaging around how Puerto Ricans, if we vote, really have the power to swing the elections one way or the other. So I did that, and then I've been working with different nonprofits. I was working with the Hispanic Federation in a project that they launched to tend to the needs of the Pulse-affected communities. After the Pulse shooting, I myself, I'm a survivor of the shooting, and I started working with them because of that. So we were creating programming and culturally competent, culturally humble services, making sure that everything was bilingual, teaching English, guiding folks through the process of applying for assistance and things like that. And then I guess it was back in 2018 that I joined Latino Justice PRODEF. So as we know, Hurricane Maria really hit Puerto Rico in a catastrophic way back in 2017, and a lot of folks were migrating to Florida, were moving here because of the lack of resources in the island, because they had lost their homes for numerous reasons, for health services. So there was an issue with how FEMA was going to cut the temporary shelter assistance that it was providing folks who have been affected by Hurricane Maria. And so Latino Justice sued FEMA, and they launched this basically recovery program for Puerto Ricans who have been affected by FEMA. So we were working directly with the families that have moved to Central Florida, to all over Florida, but a lot of them moved to the Kissimmee area, obviously Orlando as well. So we're working with them, doing intakes, figure out what their needs were, other than the legal needs, how to connect them with a lot of the resources that were like the community organizations' response was was really on point given the lack of resources. Uh, so we were really trying to coordinate with other groups and other community members and do the best that we could. This was also an election year, so 2018, it was the midterms. So there was also Latino Justice, we don't do voter registration, we do voter protection. So it was a mix of messaging of letting folks know you're here. Uh, as you seek for resources, you can also be a part of the community. You can also like have a voice in who represents you, and particularly who misrepresents you, which is the issue that was happening with how leaders were not doing the work for the people who were affected, right? And they were not pushing for FEMA to continue providing assistance to American citizens who have been, the hurricane ravaged their homes, and they had nothing to go to. So, and then our message was that we're here always to protect your rights as a voter. Not only that you can get to the polling booth, but that you're also able to cast your vote. And let me see what else. And well, I also last year it was pretty basically it was going to be the 4-year remembrance of Paul, and we with other community Puerto Rican LGBTQ members, we created a group called Del Ambiente, and that's how Puerto Ricans. It used to be a little bit derogatory, but now it's more like colloquial, kind of like the word, like the term queer that has been reclaimed by the community, and that's how you can refer to folks who are part of the LGBTQ community in Puerto Rico. So for us, it was like the people that we're trying to reach will know what we mean with how we name this group, and we have this volunteer-led community group just to focus on the holistic development of LGBTQ Puerto Ricans living in Florida. So that's pretty much all there is.
Thank you. It seems like, which is great, that you've done a little bit of everything and you've worked with a lot of different organizations. And so I wanted to ask you, it seems from what you were telling me that you worked, in person with a lot of these organizations, whether it be the immigrant community or farm workers. And so I wanted to ask you how COVID-19, with everything that's been happening from, restricting in-person contact to keeping 6 feet apart. How has that, if at all, affected your ability to work with these organizations or communities, whether it be in your role as a member of Latino Justice or just working with all of these different nonprofits?
So obviously, everything now shifted to a virtual setting. It used to be that we would be able to host community events in partnership with other organizations and talk directly to people. We actually had this whole plan laid out of how we were going to be doing census outreach in Polk Lake, Osceola, and Orange counties, hosting town halls and going to where communities are to let them know how important it is to participate in the 2020 census, to make ourselves counted so that we can get the resources and the representation that we need. And none of that was able to happen in person. And we've shifted to doing as much as we can do virtually. So Latino Justice is not typically an organization that's receiving clients constantly because we work in litigation and not individual cases. So in at least in that part, it didn't affect as much the daily operations with clients because we work a very specific set of cases that we take on. And here in Florida, a lot of the focus is on voting rights. So just as COVID was starting, which just happened to be the presidential primary election back in March, the day before that, we had to sue the state because they were kind of like not being willing to, let's say what would be the word, accommodate like the needs of folks who were having issues with I don't want to go vote in person with it was just the beginning. We barely knew anything about COVID, how it really spread, how it didn't. And the state just kind of like sat back and were not really accommodating to folks. Um, so we've been really focusing that litigation extended all the way to probably a couple of weeks ago, where a settlement was reached. And we have another litigation about Spanish access to Puerto Rican voters. So that's also been taking a lot of the focus of the work that we do in Florida. And that's obviously because Florida is such an important state for the elections, and we're nonpartisan. We just want to make sure that our people are getting the access that's guaranteed by law, and that's what we're really being focusing on. But in terms of we do a lot of coalition work with the other organizations, with the other Latinx organizations, and a lot of them are the ones that have people on the ground, and some were definitely forced to stop all on the ground operations, which is something that had never happened. Like typically, you would see that organizations with staff of over 100 people for the elections and for other issues that require going door to door and all of this, and that wasn't happening. That direct contact was not there, so you could not really talk to the community in that way. And virtual, while it does allow for, I guess, broader connectivity, we were able to host events where we have folks from California and folks from New York and folks from Florida, and we were able to connect and share our experiences. There's obviously that lack of engaging directly with someone when it turns into, okay, let me see if someone is actually tuning in to see this event that we're doing. You could have the most important information, but if people are not tuning in to actually sat down in front of a computer or in front of their phone for an hour, then the message is not getting to folks.
Mm-hmm.
And that has been unfortunate because there's just been such changes, like even with the census, how now it won't be until October, it's going to be now, this is the last month, 30 days left to complete the census. And I was just going over today, because we're working Lagos, Iola, Polk, and Orange. Like the highest self-response rate is 61.9%. And that's Orange and Lake. So that it has definitely impacted how we're able to reach people.
And I know you mentioned that there was a recent voting rights lawsuit against Florida. Can you tell me a little bit about that? And, what was the outcome, and if it was positive or negative outcome for the Latino community in Florida?
No, go ahead. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I was just going to ask also, you mentioned that it's been hard communicating, via your computer, your phone. And I know a lot of Latinos struggle with, having a stable internet access or even having electronics to be able to tune into webinars, since we're shifting to in person. So I also wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah. So in terms of the lawsuits, Latino Justice has been a part of and has led two voting rights lawsuits here in Florida in the past 2 years. One was back in 2018, and it was leading up to the midterm elections. And that was of particular interest to the Puerto Rican community living in Florida, because it was under Section 4E of the Voting Rights Act. And that session is very specific for American citizens who go to school under the American flag, but in another language. And then they move to the States. So they have the right to have any electoral materials in their language. And this is it's almost very specific to Puerto Ricans, because we go to school in Spanish, and then if we move here, everything's in English, right? So the way that the law is written and how it should be applied is that it doesn't matter if it's just one person who falls under this category. If there's one Puerto Rican in that county and that person requires to have the electoral materials in Spanish, then that person needs to have the electoral materials in Spanish. So we identified 32 counties that were not complying with this for different reasons, where they thought that it wasn't needed, where they thought that no one had requested this material, so why spend resources in getting them, even though the law doesn't say if they're required, like they should be there in case anyone requires them. And that's particularly different to another section of the law, which applies to 13 counties here in Florida, and that's based on population, which is based on the census. So that lawsuit was back in 2018. We got a positive preliminary injunction that ordered these counties to have at least to have the Spanish ballot and to have signage and to maybe try to have a hotline or something. So it was very close to the election, so we're kind of like navigating how much can we really get so close to the election, like realistically. But we did get that preliminary injunction, and that preliminary injunction was still standing up until this, I want to say the primary now. Right now, it's some parties were dismissed from the suit, so it's ongoing. And then the other one was because of COVID, and was to we were looking for more drop ballot ballot drops locations, so that folks can deliver their ballots. Like if they're doing vote by mail, they can deliver them during the early voting period in more locations. So we were looking for that. We were looking for extended period of early voting because not all the counties do offer the maximum that they could. Some of them just offer like the minimum that they have to, while others do like the full, like say for example, Orange or Osceola counties, they do from October 19th to November 11th. So that's like almost the full 2 weeks that they can do. So they do them. But there's other counties that will only do October 24th till November 11th, which is kind of like the minimum that they have to do. Of course, like some are smaller counties, so they don't have all the resources that they could need to have like 2 full weeks of early voting locations, poll workers, and all of that, which obviously it's costly. But given the times that we're living in, this unprecedented situation of having an election in the middle of a pandemic, we feel that it is very necessary to continue providing as much resources as possible so that people are not afraid to go vote. And then there's the vote by mail, which we know all the attacks that the post office has been receiving from this administration, and how voting by mail is all the wrong messaging that's being spread purposely so to instill fear in our communities about how to vote by mail, which is something that has been happening for years. There are states that that for decades now have a complete vote by mail system and elections run smoothly. Here in Florida, anyone can request their vote by mail ballot without having an excuse, medical condition, or because they're not here. So it's really not something new. It's something that people have been using for years. And this messaging that's coming from higher places is really is destructive to the to the community, and particularly to the Latinx community, which are not necessarily used to these processes of voting by mail or voting early. So we're really trying to push all the options out there. This lawsuit was settled. The settlement is, in my opinion, is not as it doesn't have as much teeth as it could have. Pretty much so the Florida, like the state, will encourage supervisors to do a lot of things, but there's a difference between like encouraging and like actually ordering and saying you have to do this. Because I can encouragement, like I can send you an email saying, "Hey, you should do this," and I think that's encouragement. So I did my part, and whether you do it or not, up to you.
Mm-hmm.
So now we are like the coalitions that would work the election protection, the voting rights, and all of that. We're really trying to push for the supervisors to offer as much resources to voters as they can. It's tough because there are 67 counties and they each operate individually.
Mm-hmm.
So each county, each supervisor has their own. Um, I forget the words.
No worries.
But pretty much they have the power to do, as long as they do the minimum that the law requires, they're okay. They don't
Mm-hmm.
to do more. So it's tough getting them to do more when they don't have to. And that's why we really need to get like people involved. We did this campaign for the primary where we were educating people about the fact that they can request a Spanish ballot anywhere in the state
Mm-hmm.
because there's a new rule proposed by the governor. So, I mean, it just relates to the ballot, right? It's not about getting all the assistance and all of that that we would have wanted, but at least there's that so people can actually read the ballot, and particularly now with the amendments that are coming up, which are always like long and confusing. So now that's going to be in Spanish. So we're really pushing for folks to request it to see if like all of the voting locations are complying with this because we very difficult to reach like some of the smaller rural areas where one might think there's not a Latinx voter, but there is, and they need
Mm-hmm.
a Spanish ballot. So we really want to get to them so they can request it and be able to vote.
And I also wanted to ask, with all of these different obstacles that the Latino community is facing, are there any personal narratives that have been shared with you from the Latino community in Florida, whether it be, I don't know how to vote by mail and I don't have the proper tools to inform myself, or I need a Spanish ballot and I don't have one?
Um, Not directly through me, but through the other community organizations that are doing a lot of the work, who are calling voters, who are engaging with them. And of course, that was kind of like the premise of some of the litigation that we brought. It's like folks do not know how to access these resources if you're not letting them know, if you're not putting out there like information in their language, then they're not going to be able to know that they can access these resources. So a lot of it falls back down to like the community and the community organizations to really push for. These are the dates that you have to record your ballot. These are the dates that you have to submit them. These are like if you're sending your ballot by mail, you need to send it at least a week before so that it gets there. So kind of like all of that message, even with the
Mm-hmm.
Spanish ballot. So let's say technically you can request your Spanish ballot everywhere, but you don't want to go out. You want to request it online. Well, if you live outside of one of the counties that send a bilingual ballot, then you really can't, because the program, like the online platform that the supervisors use, it doesn't really have an option for you to select, I want a Spanish ballot, which is something that could be easily solved. Like I'm not a web developer, but I'm figuring that it can be easily solved, and it's not. So what are people left with? Either requesting it over the phone, which realistically we know that folks are not going to be calling, at least not in the volume that we want the supervisor of elections offices to request a Spanish vote by mail ballot. And even if they did, do we know that the offices have bilingual staff to be able to take this calls? We don't know. So there's so many pieces that don't fit in, and then your option is to request it in person, but then that defeats the whole purpose of being safe and voting from your home safely, because you still have to go and request it in person, which then you might as well just go and vote in person if you're going to the office.
Right, and thank you for sharing that. I also wanted to ask, sorry, I know my dog. So I also wanted to ask, with vote by mail being one of the top issues, I think that the Latino community is facing. In your
Mhm.
opinion, what are some of the other issues that most Latinos are focused on right now, or are some of the most important issues impacting the community? As we're only about, I believe, 65 days from the election.
Yeah, I think less.
Less.
Yeah,
Yeah, I haven't
yeah,
checked recently, but we're very close.
yeah. September 1st. So yeah. Uh, so are you? Do you mean about the elections or just like overall issues?
Just in general, what do you think
Mhm.
most Latinos are focused on, in the election? What they're most worried about, what they believe is impacting us the most right now?
Definitely, I will have to say right now that for working class Latinos, definitely this uncertainty due to the high unemployment rates. When do I get back to work? Do I lose my job?
Hmm.
What's my business? Like if I'm a small business owner, catering to the Latinx community has been impacted by COVID and all of that happening. So the economy is going to play a huge part. Um, and I will have to say that even more so than the other issues who like affect our community like on a daily basis, which are like the immigration policies, which have been horrible under this administration, and even like the violence and the racial discrimination that has been erupting now, which is obviously creating this spotlight on issues that we've known have existed. They haven't ceased existing, but now it's so, and I'm guessing because of how all the tools that we have to connect now, it's just so ever present. And as Latinx folks, we can't really disconnect ourselves from like the fight that other racial groups might be going through because at the end of the day it's also we're also impacted by racism, we're also impacted by terrible policy decisions that are meant to exclude people of color from the conversation.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. I also wanted to ask you in terms of, the election coming up. Cubans have historically been the largest Latino group in Florida, but there's been a surge of Puerto Ricos in Florida, and Puerto Ricans have historically identified with the Democratic Party and Cubans with the Republican Party. And so I wanted to ask if you see any potential impact for the upcoming presidential election or even future elections.
Um, absolutely. I mean, the one thing that I could comment, and this I'm commenting Ricardo Nosa Latino Justice, we're completely nonpartisan,
Hmm.
is that while Puerto Ricans might tend toward to be more democratic, I guess, um, it parties should really not take that vote for granted
Hmm.
because there are Puerto Ricans who are heavily supporters of the Republican Party. There are Latinx politicians who are like we have Marco Rubio, who is a Cuban of Cuban descent, and he's Republican, and he's always in line with what the president says and does for political reasons or for whatever reason. But I don't think it's as easy as to say like this group is gonna vote Democrat and this other group is gonna vote
Hmm.
Republican. I think the parties really have to boil down to talking to these communities, what issues are impacting these communities, and how to connect with them and how to solve the issue in a way that then the community is like, okay, I believe you, I'm gonna vote for you.
Hmm.
Because it's not just enough to say that, for example, that Trump throws paper towel at Hurricane Maria victims.
Right. And what do you think organizations like Latino Justice should focus on? As you were saying that, it's not just something simple or Hispandering, but it's, really going out into the community and
Mhm.
talking to voters from the Latino community.
Yeah, so for us, because our focus has always been is on the election protection side, which is making sure that all eligible Latinx voters are able to cast their vote. I think that where we could perhaps play a bigger role is in dissecting these policies and how they affect Latinx communities. So in that way, we're not telling you, hey, vote for Y or Z, but these are the policies that have been implemented. This is how policies affect your community, and you have all the information you need to decide who to vote for. I think that we're in a unique position because of who we are as an organization and because of focus on Latinx rights and providing legal services to the Latinx community. Think that that could be something where we could even play a bigger role. And something
And
that's needed because you don't necessarily find out about like policies that happen in Congress or whatever, or a little line in a huge bill, but that really impacts your community unless you're like very active in that whole sphere or you have someone who tells you. So that link is kind of missing. So kind of like being able to, como decir, en arroyo habichuela, just grab all that legalese and let our community know this is what's happening up there. And not even just up there, like this is what's happening like in your local, with your local legislators, with your local council people. This is what they're doing, this is how it affects you, this is why you should be involved.
And what are some other organizations that you think are really making an impact right now in terms of reaching out to the community, getting out the vote, informing people of the Latino community, whether it be, on how to get a Spanish ballot or how to vote by mail?
Definitely. We have, fortunately in Central Florida, because of how huge the Puerto Rican and Latinx community is, we have more than a handful of organizations who are basically doing just what you said. There's the Hispanic Federation. They're a national organization, but they have a big office. They have big operations here, and they do a lot of voter engagement. There's also Alianza for Progress. They do a lot of work with the Puerto Rican community, very focused on getting out the vote, doing forums for elected officials and people running so that people can learn about their policies and who they are, etc. There's Mi Familia Vota, which also does a lot of voter engagement and immigration clinics. There's Poder Latinx, which is kind of like to around the same issues, voter engagement, immigration, all of that. So yeah, and there are smaller ones like Misión Boricua, Iniciativa Acción Puertorriqueña, Vamos for Puerto Rico. So those are on the top of my mind, like the ones that are Latinx led and really pushing for Latinx involvement in the movement, in the community.
Thank you for sharing that. It's very critical right now that I think we get our community out to vote, but also inform them of how to, especially with the new COVID-19 restrictions.
Yeah, and all the deadlines and there's just some. In theory, it's as simple as going to vote, and that's it. But it's not. You need You need to know where you're gonna go. You need to know when you're gonna go, and all of that. So.
And so I wanted to shift gears a little bit because I know you are very involved with the immigrant community. And so I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about that, especially with the Black Lives Matter movements and also the Abolish ICE recent movement. So I know that a lot of people have called this moment a reckoning. And so how do you think that the mass mobilization and the uprisings around the country are going to impact Latino organizations to mobilize the community?
I think it's been a wake-up call to Latinx folks who have seen, because sometimes we see racial issues as a black and white issue, and how it might not affect like Latinx kind of like in the middle. And this was a wake-up call to a lot of the Latinx-led organizations where you either take a stance or you don't. Obviously, like a Latino Justice, we are very clear on where we stand, and we support the Black Lives Matter movement, and we cannot pretend that there's no Afro Latinx people. Like there's everything within the what's Latinx. So to pretend that there are no Black people within our Latinx community is pretty much downright racist.
Mhm.
And I know that some Latinx communities have a huge history of racism. It's not something that you can deny, even from little comments, microaggressions like no dañe la raza, like if you go off, if you marry someone who's darker,
Mhm.
tiene pelo malo, or pan negrito lindo, things like that. You know
Mhm.
that's deeply rooted into our into our cultures, and it has to be broken down. And all of these manifestations and protests have definitely centered that and at least it's been sparking conversations. There's been a lot of webinars and Facebook Lives now precisely because of that. And they've been in response to what happened months ago with George Floyd and how you can't just pretend that it's not happening to the Latinx community as well, because it is. There's been a lot of shootings impacting Latinx individuals who were on arms and the police just shot them. So it's definitely a wake up call. It's a realization of how things are not just for the black community, for the white community, and you're kind of like in the middle, like, eh, you know. So in that sense, it's, I think that's how it's really impacted the community, and it's just sparked so many conversations, and that have even tied up to. It's interesting how it's even been tied up to like the census, like how do I identify myself? And a white Hispanic.
Right. I think you're definitely right. I think the BLM movement has definitely, you know, put people, started talking about the colorismo within the community, which I think often is, we pretend like we don't see it or it doesn't
Mhm.
exist. And now it's hard to ignore it. And so I wanted to ask also if you see any greater alliances potentially between Black and Latino organizations in regards to policing issues.
I will hope so. Again, like Latino just I not just because I work for them, but I think that Latino Justice, because of our natural the ability that we have to have a national reach, is also is one of the like the leaders, and because of our work in the criminal justice arena and criminal justice reform, we are very clear on what we're pushing for, and our messaging is clear as an organization of how we want reform, of how we want defunding of institutions that are criminalizing our communities, and how those monies could better serve directly the community instead of being used to oppress. So we're very clear on that. We're pushing and we're always building up alliances or joining other organizations that are not just Latinx led, but because it's an issue that affects us all. And I see it happening with other organizations who were not having these conversations because that wasn't they were not, I guess, catering to communities that were talking about this, so it wasn't part of their messaging, and they've had to shift because that's the reality that we're living in right now, and we can't pretend that we just simply can't pretend that this is not happening and just go on our lives.
Mhm. Right, definitely. And do you think that the Black Lives Matter movement or the recent uprisings have impacted the way that organizations have shifted to also talking about incarceration within the Latino community, whether it be ICE or, immigrants in Florida?
That absolutely for sure. In terms of like Latino justice, where we stand for, is very clear on the fact that ICE should not exist and should not be criminalizing our communities. But then with other organizations and talking more about how the Latinx community is affected by a higher arrest records than other, but there's no data. There's something that we call the Latinx data gap, which really doesn't show, because here in Florida, you're either black or white.
Mhm.
So there's no like real specific numbers as to how many Latinx folks are incarcerated. So that's something that some of the organizations locally are and will be pushing for to have that amended so that it's also taken into consideration and so that we know how policing is directly affecting our communities. Because sometimes we need the numbers so that people start like caring. If I
Mhm.
was like, there's people who if I don't see numbers, then I don't know what you're talking about. But if we're able to really put a number on this is how this type of policing is really affecting our communities, and we're not just talking about um, immigration or this or that. We're talking also about everyday lives, traffic stops, this or that, and how our people are being unjustly apprehended or things like that.
And do you, in your opinion, do you think that whether it be the BLM movement or defunding the police or abolish ICE, do you think that this will impact the mobilization of Latino communities in Florida? Will it make them, increase and come out and vote even more? Or what do you think will be the outcome?
It will have to, even if it's unfortunately, like there isn't a one issue that's like that one issue that unites absolutely everyone,
Mhm.
and everybody's just gonna race to the polls because there's one thing that happened, right? Like,
Mhm.
I mean, personally, I think there is, and it's just removing. And again, this is me personally, and that's just removing our current president. That should be like his behavior these days. His behavior today, the comments that he's making about a plane being full of looters, if those
Mhm.
are red flags that should mobilize folks to vote. But there isn't that one issue. But I'm hopeful that with all these different situations that are happening, then different people are sparked to make a difference. Whether it is because of the history of anti-LGBTQ policies that have been coming from the past 4 years, particularly against the trans community. If you care about the rights of LGBTQ people, then that should mobilize you to defend them with your vote. Whether it's because of caging children and horrible immigration policies, if you really care about children and you care about just basic human decency, that should be enough to mobilize you. If it's because of the violence that's happening and the obvious systemic racism, then this should be at the minimum enough to mobilize you. So there's so many things happening right now that should be that's part that motivates people to not just talk about voting, not just comment on Twitter, on Facebook, but like actually register to vote if they're able and vote.
Right. Thank you. And so now I want to shift to the concluding questions of the interview. So, what would you like for people to understand, and what can they do to help in this moment in time, whether it be, from COVID-19 to BLM to the LGBTQ community? What do you think is, what do you think people should understand right now?
That if you are a member of a minority group, whatever that minority group is, and whether you think that you're safe because you're not part of that other minority group, you're not really safe under this current political atmosphere that we are living in. There's constantly attacks through policy that are meant to discourage you, that are meant to oppress you, and ultimately some who are even meant to let you die by removing access to healthcare. So it's not an option to just sit this one out. If you're able to vote, you literally have to vote. And I know this is a cliche, but you really have to vote as if your life depended on it, because it really does. Stripping healthcare in the middle of a pandemic, your life depends on it. So I
Thank
think
you.
that's my message.
Thank you. And I also wanted to ask, what are you proud of as a Latinx resident in Florida?
Sorry, what's the question?
What are you proud of as a Latinx resident in Florida?
I guess that even though there's definitely issues, and issues that don't just affect the Latinx community, but everybody, this is a huge, at least Central Florida, a huge melting pot of different Latinx cultures. And taking the politics aside, we're a rich and vibrant community who are just gonna continue growing. So if we could like come to a sense of harmony politically. But other than that, I think we have so much to give as a community, whether through the arts, whether through all the work that's being carried on the backs of the Latinx folks who are carrying just about every single industry here. That's a lot to be proud of. But we got to understand the power that we have, and we don't have that power if we just sit back down.
Thank you. And what do you want to see in Florida in 10 years, or how do you envision the future of Florida beyond 10 years?
I really hope that the next generations can actually make it so that this state is more more livable for people. And again, I always say that Orlando is like a bubble. There's a very progressive city, or Orange County itself is a very progressive county. But everybody outside of the little bubbles, it's a different world. And not everybody has the same opportunities, and there's people that are literally afraid for their lives. So I hope that that changes.
And is there anything you would like to add or say that we didn't touch on during this interview?
I don't think so, but if you think of something that you want to revisit or come back to me, you please feel free to reach me.
Okay, thank you so much, Ricardo. So this concludes our interview, and I'm going to go ahead and hit stop.